Hello, the purpose of this tutorial is to give a demonstration on how I used a Photoshop technique called displacement mapping to turn this base image and this overlay into this final image. The technique of displacement mapping allows for the texture overlay to seemingly wrap around the contour of the face in the base image. If you take a little bit of a closer look, you'll see it's most noticeable where the highlights and shadows are at their deepest. As you can see, where the texture overlay wraps around the bottom of the lip and the top of the lip and seems to mold in there nicely, almost as if the overlay was painted on. You can also see it quite nicely in the eyebrows, where the texture overlay seems to bend and mold to the contour of the eyebrows, and also the eyelids, and also wrapping around the general contour of the face. So, starting with this base image, I took this photo specifically with displacement mapping in mind. I used lighting that is a little bit harder and more contrasty than what I would typically use in a beauty portrait. This was done with a butterfly lighting setup, which was just one light dead center on her face, pointing down at her at roughly a 45-degree angle. That's what creates the deeper shadows underneath the nose and also underneath the eyebrows. I did all of the retouching in advance, and I'll just show you what I did layer by layer to save you the time of watching me do these things live. First thing I did was I copied the background layer, and then I applied a Gaussian blur just slightly of 2 pixels to kind of dull down the natural skin texture, because we're going to be superimposing a texture over it, and we don't want the texture of the overlay to clash with the texture of the skin. So a before and after, and like I said, that was just dulling down the texture of her skin. The next was a basic skin cleanup. Again, this is not a full skin retouch, but this was just to remove the most obvious blemishes and marks that were on her skin. Then I applied a black and white layer for no purpose other than to make it easier for me to see what I'm doing when I did dodging and burning, which are in these 2 layers here. And I used dodging and burning not only to even out some skin tones, mostly on the dodge layer, but also to add a very specific contour of my choosing to the whole face, and also to accentuate some of the shadows and highlights that were already there. For instance, I used the burn layer to accentuate the contour around her eyelids and eyebrows, also around her lips and her cheeks, so on and so forth. You get the idea. Is to just make the face a little bit more contrasty, give it more of an obvious contour for the overlay to wrap around. It's worth noting that when you're applying these overlays, the overlays will not wrap around anything that is completely black or completely white, so you don't want to push the dodging and burning or the overall contrast too far. For my dodge layer, it was done with a curves layer where I just pulled up the midpoint up and then masked it off, and I did the exact opposite with the burn layer, took the midpoint and pulled it down and then masked it off. I know there are other ways to do dodge and burn. You can use whatever method works best for you. This next layer, I just called it symmetry because I used it to blacken out some of these areas that made the image asymmetrical. Again, I used curves to do that just by pulling one of the darker areas all the way down to almost black. masking it off and then brushing it in. Okay, it's at this point where I completed a crucial step in displacement mapping. Before I added any of these other layers, I flattened these out. I converted them to an 8-bit grayscale. 8-bit is very important because you have to use 8-bit throughout the process for these images or it won't work. So anyway, I flattened out all of these layers before these other ones were created. And then went to image mode, converted it to grayscale, and made sure that it was an 8-bit. And then I saved it as a completely different file. You have to save it as a PSD file. And this file I called Displacement. As you can see, it looks exactly the same, but this one is, as I said, in 8-bit grayscale. So now that I had the displacement file, the PSD file, I have my overlay here. I'll show you where I got it. I'll go ahead and shut that down. And we're not going to save it. I got that overlay texture from a website called Pexels. Pexels is a great source for free stock images. And if you click on license, you'll see that any stock image that you download from Pexels can be used for any personal or commercial purpose. So you can use these images without being worried about sued for copyright infringement. I went into the Pexels search engine and I put in the word pattern, and I found this pattern here, and that's where I downloaded it from. Go ahead and download it again, and ended up with this. I'm going to add a black and white layer. There's a few bits of color on there that I don't think are appropriate for this image, so I'm going to go ahead and make it a black and white image. I will flatten that. Now the important part is that when you have your overlay image, you have to make sure that it's the exact same size as the base image that you are applying it over. So the base image here, if you check and look and see image size, the image size is 8 inches by 10 inches at 300 ppi, which means that we want to make sure that this is 8 inches by 10 inches at 300 ppi. First we'll rotate it, then we'll crop it at a 4:5 aspect ratio and bring this down. And I don't remember exactly how I cropped it, but maybe it was something like that. Have the crop, and then I want to change the image size to make sure that it is 8 inches by 10 inches at 300 ppi. Okay, so now I have that texture and it's the same size as the base image as well as the displacement image. And take that overlay and go to filter, distort, and displace. This is the part in which it you alter this texture overlay so that it kind of warps and wraps around the contour of the base image. I'll just keep these these default settings here. Stretch to fit or tile doesn't matter because we've already made sure that it's the same size as the base image that we're displacing. Click on OK. It's going to ask you for a file. You have to use the PSD file that we created. As you can see, the JPEG files are not even available as an option, because like I said, you need a PSD file for this. And go ahead and click on open. Now there was a subtle change. Command Z to go before and after, before and after, so you can see how this texture overlay was warped. And to see the full effect, what was done was clicking on duplicate layer and then choosing the JPEG of the face. It's already done for us right here. When you originally copy that layer, it will copy in normal blending mode, so you'll end up with something that looks like this. What you have to do is you have to change it. You can use either overlay, soft light, or hard light, but overlay is usually a good place to start. Soft light might work better for some overlays and some images. Hard light, not so much. But overlay is usually a good starting point. So now, if you take a close look, you'll see how that overlay, because it was warped through displacement mapping, actually looks like it is curving around the contour of the eyebrow and the eyelids on both sides. The curve of the nose, especially as the nostrils flare out. The contour of the lips does a really nice job. Could look like it's a tattoo. In this case, it almost looks like it was painted on in latex. So now that that was done, that's a baseline. Then I made a few corrections. The first thing I noticed was that this part of the pattern seemed to be sticking out and was a little bit brighter than the rest. So I go ahead and made an adjustment there, using curves to basically burn in and mellow out that bright spot right there. The next layer I called Contrast Pop, but what it actually was, I renamed it, but what it actually was just I created another black and white layer, and I changed the blending mode to soft light, which added some contrast, and then I believe I turned the opacity down to 50%, and then I ended up renaming it Contrast Pop. So what I just did in that layer is the same thing that I did in this layer here, just to show you how I got there. This next layer I called Symmetry, and I used a curves layer to blacken out some of the darker shadows, just to add some symmetry to the overall image along the sides of the face here and the corners. Again, that was for the sake of symmetry. And then this last layer called Nose Cleanup, because as I zoomed in, even though I did the Gaussian blur in the beginning, some of the pores on the nose were still very noticeable even after I put Gaussian blur on it. So I just used basic spot healing brush to clean up some of those pores. From this point forward, I mean, you can go on and do whatever other adjustments you need. You can fiddle around with whatever layers are already there. For instance, you don't have to use this first black and white layer. You can see how the overlay might interact with the full color image. I liked it better converting it to black and white, but it's all going to depend on what you want to do. And from this point forward, just make whatever other alterations you would want to make to this image to get the final look that you want. But hopefully this video gave you the basic steps that you need to at least get started in an image like this. And I hope you enjoyed it.